Call this work session to order. We will start with a roll call, just along the dais. We'll start with you, Mr. Larson.
Michael Taylor. Felix Rivera.
Austin Davidson. Suzanne LaFrance.
Lisa Slusner.
Forrest Dunbar.
Eric Croft. Dick Ray. Pete Peterson.
Becky Lynn Pearson, Municipal Attorney.
D. Cindy Thompson.
And why don't we just go down here too, starting with, actually don't know your name, then next one, D.
My name is Megan Carmichael, Assistant Municipal Attorney. Deanne is Deputy Municipal Attorney.
Jason Bockenstedt, Mayor's Office.
Owner Grass, Mayor's Office.
Great. Okay, so I guess I should start by saying that despite the fact we're doing this in the Assembly Chamber, I don't want to give the impression this is more formal than a typical work session. We're only doing this because we have a special meeting in an hour. We didn't want to have to make everybody cruise across town. So just a normal work session. We just happen to be doing it in the Assembly Chamber. So with that, I believe there is a PowerPoint that we're going to start with by the sponsors, Mr. Trainee and the administration. So take it away.
All right, since PowerPoint is to explain.
I'm sorry, ma'am. Will you speak into the microphone?
All right, is that better?
Yes, please.
So this PowerPoint is to explain this Anchorage Ordinance 2018-74. So this ordinance amends Title VII, which is the purchasing section of the Anchorage Municipal Code. It requires qualifying construction projects to be reviewed for a community workforce agreement before soliciting bids or proposals. It requires a CWA review team to evaluate qualifying construction projects to consider if the CWA would advance important MOA interests. Qualifying project under the ordinance is any construction project, which includes projects for renovation, new construction, expansion, and demolition, where costs are estimated to exceed $3.5 million. The costs do not include MOA contract management or architectural engineering services. And under the ordinance, construction projects shall not be divided into smaller components or phases in order to avoid CWA review. And construction projects of less than $3.5 million, but are phases or components of a larger project, may be referred to the CWA team on a case-by-case basis. Here's an example of some MOA construction projects which were over $3.5 million in the last 3 years. You can review those and look at what projects this ordinance would apply to. So under the ordinance, the master community workforce agreement is a pre-bid contract that is part of the bid package or RFP that will be entered into by contractors and the trade council following a bid award or RFP selection. The prime contractor and the trade council can renegotiate the terms post-award upon mutual agreement. And the municipality of Anchorage is not a signatory to the CWA. The municipality does not implement or administer the agreement. And the union is the collective bargaining representative for workers on the project. And only contractors and subcontractors who sign the agreement can work on the project. And in exchange, unions promise labor peace through the life of the contract in advancement of identified important government interests. And in the Anchorage model, those are primarily pre-bid union concessions, the growing of apprenticeship labor, and to assist with disadvantaged groups with placement into the apprenticeship programs. Under the ordinance, the general requirements for the CWA is for the project bidder to hire workers through the union hiring halls, to follow specified dispute resolution procedures, comply with union wage, benefit, apprenticeship, and other rules, and contribute to union benefit funds. And under the ordinance, the final executed terms of the community workforce agreement must include these things: funding through employer contributions for bona fide apprenticeship training programs, promote employment of apprentices, encourage employment of military veterans and members of the National Guard or reservists, promote the employment of socially and economically disadvantaged members of the community by using union hiring halls. Ensure that hiring hall lists are open to all, not just to union members. A standard grievance and arbitration process for resolving problems with the CWA. And an oversight committee for project issues and disputes, which also tracks and reports the apprenticeship and hiring preferences back to the municipality. Some history of community workforce agreements around the country.
Pete, do you want it now or?
They're widely used by state and local governments on public works projects.
Ma'am, if I could stop for a second, we have a question from Mr. Peterson. And to my colleagues, again, this is a normal work session, so flag me down if you've got a question. Go ahead, Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering if the new Supreme Court decision would have any effect on this type of a contract.
So we do have a slide on that. I can answer your question now, or we can get to the slide. It's up to you.
Okay, all right, well, you went, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Okay.
So the history of CWAs has been widely used around the country over the years, including on federal hydroelectric dams and the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And the United States Supreme Court has approved of project labor agreements, and just for the audience's purposes, project labor agreements is a fairly interchangeable term with community workforce agreements. They're essentially the same thing, but some of the case law uses the term project labor agreements. So the United States Supreme Court approved of PLAs as an effective tool for owner-developers to deal with conditions in the construction industry. And in 2009, President Obama issued an executive order that encourages executive agencies to consider PLAs on a case-by-case basis for large-scale construction projects where the federal costs exceed $25 million. And this executive order is still in place. Under federal law, which is the National Labor Relations Act, employers are allowed in the construction industry to enter into pre-hire agreements. And pre-hire agreements are collective bargaining agreements providing for union recognition, union dues, and mandatory use of union hiring halls prior to the hiring of any employees. And that comes from the Supreme Court case known as the Boston Harbor case from 1993. And that case talks about the fact that Congress intended to accommodate conditions specific to the construction industry, such as the short-term nature of employment, which makes post-hire collective bargaining difficult, the contractor's need for predictable costs, and the steady supply of skilled labor, and a long-standing custom of pre-hire bargaining in the construction industry specifically. So moving on to that City and Borough of Juneau resolution, which is the model for the Anchorage Ordinance. City and Borough of Juneau has used community workforce agreements, also known as project labor agreements, for more than 10 years on certain public construction projects. I think they've been using them since the 90s, actually. And they enacted a resolution in 2014 which supports the use of PLAs on certain public construction projects of more than $4 million. And Juneau's resolution requires a review team to determine whether an important public benefit, goal, or objective is met by the use of a PLA on each proposed project. Under Juneau's resolution, the team analyzes each proposed project using the above criteria, and they draft a written record of their deliberations to document each decision. And using this model, Juneau has approved and disapproved of using project labor agreements in the past, depending on the individual circumstances of each case. And Juneau's model was upheld by the Alaska Superior Court in 2008 because, once again, Juneau has been using these since the 90s, and they were challenged, and their model was upheld in 2008 by the Superior Court. And Anchorage's ordinance is modeled after the Juneau resolution. So some legal considerations for CWAs in Alaska. Under the law, public employers in Alaska may require successful bidders on public construction projects to enter into CWAs with local labor unions under the Alaska Constitution and the Procurement Code. The Alaska Supreme Court has approved of CWAs on public construction projects on a case-by-case basis. Blanket CWA requirements on all public construction projects would likely be unconstitutional, And laborers versus Lampkin case from 1998 is an important Supreme Court decision from Alaska that discusses this. And under Alaska law, public employers must, case by case, analyze each proposed construction project to determine if a CWA would advance legitimate, important government interests. And the terms of the CWA itself must be closely tailored to achieving those interests. And the case talked about public employers have a significant interest in ensuring that construction projects are completed on schedule and within budget, and that CWAs may be a legitimate tool to help public employers achieve these goals. But also under the case law, agencies must show more than a general desire for labor stability so that the work will be completed on time. Some more legal analysis under the Equal Protection Clause of the Alaska Constitution. Once again, from the Lampkin case, the Alaska Supreme Court ruled that CWAs do not violate the equal protection rights of non-union workers under the Alaska Constitution. And that case decided that non-union contractors have no constitutionally protected right to avoid bid specifications requiring them to enter into CWAs. And the court found that the terms of CWAs apply equally to all contractors on a project, both union and non-union, and that non-union contractors have the choice of not bidding on projects that require CWAs. And the court also ruled that CWAs that require employers to contribute to fringe benefits do not violate the takings clause of the Alaska Constitution. And finally, under some different case law, courts have ruled that promoting local hire is not a legitimate public interest because it is unconstitutional under state and federal law. So under that Lampkin case, it also talked about CWAs and procurement codes, and the court found that the general purpose of competitive bidding under procurement is to prevent fraud and to ensure that public entities receive the best work at the most reasonable prices. The court found that the primary purpose of public bidding is to advance the public interest, not the bidder's interest, and that public entities must have a reasonable basis to determine that CWAs advance government interests by analyzing each proposed CWA on a case-by-case basis. And the court found that although CWAs may restrict some competition, they may offer other benefits that advance the public interest, such as efficiency and apprenticeship programs. And the benefits of using CWAs on certain public construction projects may outweigh the disadvantages of restricting competition, depending on the individual circumstances of each case. But the court made it clear that agencies must consider the goals of competitive bidding before deciding to use CWAs.
Can I ask a really narrow, highly legalistic question? Is a reasonable basis a term of art, and is it different than rational basis?
So the court talks about legitimate basis, that the government must have a legitimate reason to advance, that the agency must find that a CWA advances legitimate, important interests.
So that would be, would you interpret that as a slightly higher standard than a rational basis?
It is a higher standard than rational basis. I would say it's in the middle of the road, less than a compelling, but more than rational basis.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Hey, Mr. Welcome.
I actually have a list of questions I'm jotting down, hoping we can go back through it, but while we're on this, so, if there's some goals that would be met through a CWA, but could also be met through a variety of other ways, how would you decide which way to go?
We do have some slides on that at the end. We have a slide about our questions where we can go into that, or I can attempt to answer that now if you'd like. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Welcome.
Thank you.
Please proceed.
So the Anchorage Ordinance talks about a CWA review team, which is once again based, based on the Juno model, which also uses a review team. And under the Anchorage Ordinance, the CWA review team is composed of 5 people, which is the municipal manager, the director of project management and engineering, the department member with the project, a trades council representative, and a contractor representative. And under the ordinance, the Director of Project Management and Engineering is the chair of the CWA team. And decisions and recommendations of the team are made by a simple majority vote. And when the MOA department proposes a project, before the purchasing officer procures construction services, the project is referred to the CWA review team. And the team determines if the CWA is required and issues a written decision describing how CWA would advance the important interests of the municipality. And if the team decides that a CWA is required, a master CWA is included in the solicitation and bid documents. Under the ordinance, the CWA team has some review criteria that they're looking at to determine if the CWA would advance important government interests on a case-by-case basis. So some of these government interests that have been identified in the case law include, but are not limited to, timely and efficient completion of a project, minimizing costs and delays, workplace safety, labor peace and stability, labor concessions, supporting and growing a qualified and competent workforce, and viable economic activities in the community. Also, the case law talks about the project criteria can include, but it's not limited to, the scope of the project, the complexity, design, and construction features, labor needs and volume, number and types of trades required, and timeliness considerations. The summary of the Anchorage ordinance: the municipality may require successful bidders on public construction projects to enter into CWAs with local labor unions under the Alaska Constitution and Procurement Code. And the CWA team considers each construction project on a case-by-case basis to ensure that a CWA properly advances important and legitimate public interests. And the terms of the CWA are closely tailored to achieving that interest. And those interests may include meaningful labor concessions, an adequate supply of a well-trained, skilled workforce, labor stability, timely and efficient project completion, uniform grievance procedures, and cost control. And the size, length, and complexity of each project are also factors to consider. And then the CWA team drafts a written record of their deliberations to document each decision. So, in response to one of the members' questions about the recent United States Supreme Court case of Janus versus ASME, the Janus U.S. Supreme Court case prohibits public employers from collecting agency fees from non-union employees without their written affirmative consent. However, the Janus decision only applies to public sector employers and public sector unions. It does not apply to private sector unions, and it does not change federal law, but authorizes the use of pre-hire agreements in the construction industry. So as a result, MOA may require bidders on public construction projects to enter into CWAs that contain union dues or agency fee provisions. The agency fees may be collected by contractors and transmitted to private sector unions without private employees' written affirmative consent, waiving their constitutional rights under the First Amendment. These agreements are allowed under federal law, and the municipality may legally enforce such agreements. So the Janus decision does not really affect the system. Does that answer the question? So here's some questions that we received from some assembly members, and sort of getting back to Mr. Weddleton's question about, there's many other ways to accomplish some of these goals, and how would a CWA help these problems. So I think maybe Mr. Weddleton, number 5, would be getting to your question. And we found that there have been some recent complex projects within the municipality, including MLMP Phase 2, or Power Plant 2, as well as the Deny Center, that they have used PLAs, and those projects have benefited from the efficiency of things like pre-job conferences, standard dispute resolution procedures, and skilled craft workers to complete projects on time and within budget. So we feel like there's some support in Anchorage as well as in other jurisdictions like Juneau that have had success with accomplishing these goals with the CWA. So with the number one question is there data to show the goals that we seek are met in the Juneau model? And based on our research, we found that Juneau had success in increasing their apprenticeship utilization on covered projects. The apprenticeship utilization increased from 15% to 20%. And I believe we have a member in the audience today from the Juneau Building Trades representative who will be able to address this topic further, is my understanding. Does that help answer part of your question?
Yeah, I mean, some things like the, pre-building conference, I mean, I assume that's done on every project anyway. The city gets together with the contractors, that's probably part of the bidding process even. It starts writing, so there's things like that are already done, so, it should all be coordinated. How does this augment that?
I think a CWA, puts those practices in writing, creates some obligations on all parties to comply with those procedures as a condition of even bidding on the project.
But we can do that anyway. We do that with planning things. You have to have a pre-application conference before you do a planning thing. And that's pretty simple. It makes such obvious sense that I don't even think you need it in code.
It seems that in the other models that we've looked at, both around the country and within the state of Alaska, that a CWA can help accomplish those goals, although there might be other ways to accomplish it. We feel like that there's a proven track record that CWAs can help with these issues. So, number two, how do CWAs develop economic opportunities? According to the U.S. Department of Labor, apprentices who complete their program earn approximately $300,000 more in their careers than non-apprenticeship workers. And the joint labor management apprenticeship programs also ensure qualified craft workers through licensed instructors, facilities, dedicated training equipment, formalized links for veteran hire, coordination for reentry programs, and financial management mentoring. So there's already formalized systems in place to help develop economic opportunities. Some other questions that we received about safety, like how do CWAs improve safety, and don't OSHA, workers' comp, and the municipality rules already ensure safety on the work site. And under the ordinance, an oversight committee is there to resolve disputes relating to safety. And we feel like an informal resolution process that the ordinance discusses addresses safety issues quickly, cooperatively, more efficiently, and less expensive than government enforcement agencies. Another question that we received about hiring halls, and if contractors have a team of employees that they already work with, can those employees sign up at the hiring hall and be chosen by the contractor? And would the unions send who the union wants to send, or would the union send who the contractor wants to hire? And based on our research, it's common practice for contractors to send their existing workforce through the halls, and the unions send who the contractors want to hire.
Right? Could
You go
I
ahead.
jump in on that? So, yeah. I mean, that just seems like you put it over a wall up in someone's process. I'm not a contractor. I have to kind of guess how these things work, but you can have maybe if you have your general contractor, you might have a small staff, and he works with a dozen or more subcontractors and all the variety of things that need to be done on the project. And many of those subcontractors get fairly small. Maybe the electrical or the who knows what, and they have a crew of 10 people that they've worked with for many, many years, and they all know how to work together. It's a very seamless operation. So they need to go through a CWA for this project. And they say, okay, well, I'll have you go down to the hiring hall, and then I'll ask them to bring you in. Okay, well, what if none are vets, none are ex-convicts, none are living in Muldoon or wherever you're going to call it underprivileged, troubled population? They're just people, maybe they're not. They've been working for 10 years for this guy, so they have plenty of money. So they do good work. So you've not met the goals that were stated to the CWA. But you've given the guy the workers you had before, but through this convoluted process, and the workers are going to make less money because now they're paying union dues, et cetera, and so on. They're paying into a pension that they may probably would never collect from. So it's just really complicated things for this team that's worked well together, maybe an awesome company. And it doesn't meet the CWA's goals. If you meet the CWA goals, he doesn't get the people that he's used to working with. He goes, all new crew. That's just, I just know how people could function under that. It'd be very odd. And you'd be basically throwing your regular staff under the bus to bid on a CWA contract. I mean, I don't know, that's the thing that jumps out to me on this more than anything is all these subcontractors and they lose their teams.
Well, for one thing, under the ordinance, the hiring halls have to be open to all, not just to union members or union employees. And based on our research, it is fairly common practice in the construction industry for these hiring halls to send employees that the contractor wants to hire at their request. And there may be others in the audience who have more knowledge on this, or others here who could speak to that maybe a little better than I could. I don't know if we want to open it up to others to speak.
Yeah. So the people, D, you have your hand up?
Yeah.
So of D, and then Ono, you have more people you'd like to speak as well? Okay, go ahead, D.
Yeah, I was going to say the goals are as to the overall project, not just to the segments. So there are going to be some segments that go right to the hiring hall to get hired back. So that is going to happen. So they're not going to get thrown under the bus. But the unions still have to meet the overall preferences into the apprenticeship programs, the overall hours. And apparently they've been successful in the Juno model. And I think at some point it might be helpful to have the Juno trade person come up and explain that in the hiring hall, how that is working, so we don't have intimate details on that.
Is that okay, John? We were going to hear from that person anyway. Yeah, so now would be a good time. Do you have more you want to wrap up, or we can switch to the representative from Juno?
I'm fine switching.
Great. So there was somebody here from Juno, I believe. If you wanted to come and talk a little bit about your experience, I think that's really valuable data for us. Please identify yourself for the record.
Yeah, so I'm Rodney Hessen. I'm president of Juno Building Trades Council, and I'm with IBEW Local 1547 down in Juno. I guess what I would start off by saying is the apprenticeship is the main thing that I look at. As you all know, retirement is just exploding, right? There's plenty of people retiring from a certain generation, baby boomers. With those people leaving, they're taking lots of institutional knowledge. We cannot train apprentices fast enough to keep up with that trend in the population. So what we do is we order, it's 15% of all man hours worked on the project, so some contractors in certain trades will not even use apprentices, but others will. And hopefully we'll get to that 15% requirement. We actually increased it up to 20% requirement in our master agreement down in Juno. This was brought up to us by the city manager, Rory Watt, soon after I became president of the council. We all agree that we need to do more for succession planning, and by using these PLAs or CWAs, we are working towards that goal in an increased percentage at this point. The apprentices definitely get great experience on these projects because they're the larger projects. So, Mr. Welton was talking about the smaller shop with maybe the 10-person crew that's very tight. They'll probably work on some smaller projects in town. If they do work on a PLA, they may take some of their guys, but not all. But they may end up using the entire crew on a PLA project as well. The main thing with that apprenticeship, though, is that we have to keep training for the future workforce. We've seen economic slowdown all across the state, and so we've seen workers leaving for opportunity elsewhere, go outside to work. And by using the local hiring halls, we can put our locals to work at the municipal level, it's something that we really strive for because those locals make that money and spend it within the community, and so the community benefits by local hire. The economy is bolstered somewhat, and so we had a project that I referred to in Juneau on the cruise ship docks. There was a big project, 16B it was called, huge 48-inch piling, new docks to accommodate the larger Panamax ships that we're seeing more and more of. And this project did not have a POA attached. So in investigating the job as it unfolded, we were looking at the workers, and there were 1s and 2s on each crew that were local guys, if even. There were plenty of other guys from out of state that came in and worked, made thousands of dollars, and then left the state with that money. Didn't benefit the economy much at all. So, that's what we look at on our council down in Juneau. Obviously, that's something the Assembly cares about in Juneau as well.
Okay, I'm sorry, can I interrupt you for just a second?
Yes.
I want to ask a question of the attorney, and then Mr. Peters has a question as well. So you just stressed local hire, which I certainly support as a concept, but in the presentation we were given by the attorneys, it said that courts have said that local hire is not a legitimate public interest. So how do you reconcile those two things?
Well, the case laws that declare local hire to be unconstitutional have been when public agencies, state or federal governments have written statutes with local hire as a purpose in the statute itself. So we feel like that this does not implicate those same problems of some of the other case law where there's a direct law created by a public entity that has local hire as its purpose.
So it's, there's the explicit purpose of the ordinance, but you say a side effect in a lot of cases appears to be that there's more local hire, even though it's not an explicit purpose of the law.
Correct.
Okay, great.
Yeah, if I may, it comes as a function of the hiring hall referral procedure.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so the apprentice program, they're required to have a certain number of hours worked before they can complete their apprenticeship. And with this slowdown in our economy, there's been maybe fewer jobs out there available. And so it takes longer for them to get through the apprenticeship. So how many hours are required to complete that?
It depends on the apprenticeship, but for our own, it's 8,000 hours. Some are 10,000 hours. 2,000 hours a year is average. So in a big overtime year, you get probably 3,000 hours or more. So 4 to 5 year apprenticeship is pretty average.
But if there wasn't that much work and they were getting 1,500 hours a year, then it might take them 5 or 6 years to complete the apprenticeship.
That's true.
And in the meantime, older generation, like baby boomers,
We're discussing the older generation.
we already are retired, and then there's no one there to take our place. So I can see the situation that the labor market is facing right now.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Do you have anything more to present to us? I kind of interrupted you there.
I think that's it, unless anybody has any questions.
Mr. Welton?
Thanks. Unions are all new to me when I got on the assembly, but I visited a number of them, and the whole training program stuff was a surprise. I was very impressed with what I saw. But non-union operations also have training programs, and it kind of questions that sense that, this can be used too. And what would be the mechanism then if this were sent through a hiring hall? I guess there might be several hiring halls, right? Because if you have laborers and electricians and plumbers, it'd be hard to do several hiring halls. But if you have non-union training programs for those, do they get hired through those hiring halls and go through these non-union training programs? Is there a mechanism there, or does it just write off these non-union training apprentice programs?
No, I believe what happens in that instance is as long as their apprenticeship program is, as it said in slide bona fide, program, basically following federal apprenticeship guidelines, then they're, free to work on the PLA as well.
Do non-union operators, because I know we have Alaska Building ABC or something like that as a group. So obviously I'm really ignorant about this, so I'm trying to learn, but they have kind of a unified organization too. So is that a hiring hall? You have to apply for this project through ABC, and you'll go through ABC's people's training. Is that a legitimate route, or is that gone?
So their apprenticeship program is, to answer your question, not a hiring hall. But people from that program could go through a hiring hall and work on projects.
Okay, so you could go through the IBEW hiring hall, but you're going to be in a different, not IBEW apprentice program potentially.
I think at that point, the worker would have to choose to obviously join the union and then be accepted into that apprenticeship program. So it'd be like a transfer.
Well, so some of the project could be, you hired through the IBEW hiring hall, for example, and they'd sign up for that apprenticeship program, but others might say, oh, I want to be in this other apprenticeship program.
Well, it's specific to the trades.
But it would be an electrical one that might be a non-union training program. But if there's such a thing.
They could come from that program and join the IBEW program.
But they'd be using the IBEW apprentice program. You're pretty much routed to that.
Right.
Ona, do you have something on that?
Yeah, we have another person here who might be able to answer Mr. Weldon's questions. Aaron Clickett, who has lived through the apprenticeship programs and other CWA and PLA projects.
Thank you. Mr. Clickett?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Mr. Weldon's question in regards to that is it's very common that we'll see apprentices that will come through early years in an ABC apprenticeship program. Maybe later on they choose to come over and apply for one of our programs, where we will then in turn grant them credit for those hours to the state who is overseeing these apprenticeship programs for when they actually achieve the completion of those 10,000 hours and who's monitoring it. So it is pretty common that we'll see somebody come in the hypothetical of a non-union employer brings a workforce in, he brings an apprentice. I would say those hours would directly count. If the apprentice chose after the job to go back to the non-union employer and the ABC apprenticeship program, those hours would directly be acceptable for them to achieve their amount they need to take their licensing examinations.
Okay.
All right.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go ahead, Ms. LaFrance.
And I understand there's someone from ABC here who could also speak to that other piece of it.
Sure. If the sponsors are done with their presentation, then we could, any member could call up anybody at a work session. But it looks like they're pretty much done. Mr. Trainee, this is yours. Is there anything you want to say? I mean, this is your ordinance.
The administration has anything else? Anybody else you have to call up?
No, we don't.
I have a legal question before we go further. So,
And by the way, I don't think just from Muldoon or disadvantaged or depressed workers. I object to referring to people from Muldoon that characteristic. I thought I had the forced.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. I'm sure Mr. Welton didn't mean anything by it.
Well,
And it's
at the
true.
point, it has specifically been said in some of the
Yeah.
questions I've been sent that that's Mountain View and places like that.
Yeah, they're actually, the state has designated parts of my district as economically disadvantaged. So, but there's some, there's still some very beautiful parts, and so all of the building is beautiful. Damn it. Okay, so I wanted to ask. You said this was based on the Juneau ordinance, but are there differences? I mean, is it word for word what they have in Juneau? Are there differences? And if there are, could you sort of highlight those again?
So it's not based word for word on Juneau's resolution. Juneau's resolution, I would say, is a little more simple, a little more basic. I would think the Anchorage ordinance is a little more detailed. Juneau's is also a resolution as opposed to an ordinance. Anchorage is codifying it in the law. So I have a copy of the resolution here. It talks about the important goals that the Lampkin case talked about. It talks about the review team and that The review team is made up of 3 employees as opposed to 5 under the Anchorage ordinance. The review team that decision can also be referred to another committee under the Juneau model. And the Juneau model also uses an amount of $4 million, and the Anchorage ordinance uses the $3.5 million. Those are some of the general differences of the two.
So you're an attorney who obviously is presenting it in sort of a neutral fashion. Is there anyone from the administration who can talk for like a policy justification for why the changes? Anyone can make sort of the policy call argument. Oh, no?
The administration, in working with Mr. Trainee, put forward this ordinance in the effort to help boost workforce development in the Anchorage and the state of Alaska. The apprenticeship program success rates through union operations tend to be more successful statistically. The workforce, as they have already outlined, is going through a crest where we need to do a lot of work to make sure that we have a workforce capable of the infrastructure needs over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And to answer one of Mr. Weddleton's questions, this is not the only thing that exists to help this process. It is one tool in a toolbox, if you will, for construction, that will help move the needle towards a more successful process for this city and the state at large. The last thing that we want to see is a big project coming in for the state and the people who live here not benefiting economically from that work. We need to make sure that there are robust, trained, working members of this community to do the work that's going to be required to make sure that we progress the way we need to over the next few years.
So, yeah, go ahead, Mr. Welton, and I've got a question too.
I understand that, accept that, it sounds very logical, and I've become a trained IBEW electrician, which would be totally awesome, and I go where the work is and I leave. So we'll be training people, our local contractors are paying for these training programs, we train them up, and they go to Seattle, or wherever the future is booming in lower 48 and it's not here, so then they become non-residents. But I guess the union people would tell me, what I've heard from union people who have been emailing us is that a lot of the locally trained kind of Alaskan workers of all types have left to where there's work. And what happens, and correct me, so this is just, like I said, they're without like big knowledge. But then in the local hiring hall, they stay on the list here. So if we have a project here, even if they're in Seattle working, if there's kind of connections with Alaska, they come, or maybe they're on the Alaska Union branch or whatever it is, that they get hired first in front of someone who may actually be living here. I mean, to me, that's not real local hire.
I would say that the next step in this process is to make sure that there are projects that can keep all of these people busy and being trained through the apprenticeship programs. So this is foundational to making sure that that can happen. And I think that if we have a choice between making sure that the people who are doing the work in this city and state can stay in this city and state, that we have to focus there. If they have decided to move because there is no longer work because of dwindling capital budgets or lacking private projects, then I would imagine that bringing those people back is the best option that we have, as opposed to people who haven't been trained here.
So, are you going to... go ahead, Austin, you have a question? I'll go after you.
Thanks, Boris. Mr. Chair. I have 2 questions. One is, I'm just not really familiar with the Trades Council, so since the Trades Council and the contractor would be the parties to the agreement, can you just describe what the Trades Council is and how that works? And then my second question is on page 4, it lists the CWA shall at a minimum include terms effectuating the following, and it's things like encouraging employment of military veterans, which I think is great, promoting employment of socially and economically disadvantaged members of the community, which I also think is great. Words like encourage, promote, ensure, how does that actually get into the agreement, and how do we ensure that it's actually happening, since it's very aspirational?
So to answer the first question, I believe that Mr. Plickett can answer your question about the building trades. And This document, this ordinance, is the framework for what will come forward in the CWA master agreement, where all of that language would be detailed and specified. So this is the guiding document, if you will, to make sure that the CWA that comes across with the RFPs includes that kind of treatment in the document.
And that's something that Muni staff evaluate. That doesn't
Yes.
come back to December.
Yes.
Thanks.
Can that be, just as a follow-up on what she said, can that have a level of specificity of like, you shall have 10% veterans on this project?
Yes. Aaron, do you want to come up and tell about who the building trades are?
Absolutely. The Building Trades Council is made up of the 16 separate individual craft unions. So that could be anywhere from the plumbers and steam fitters, who I represent, to the IBEW, the block layers, cement finishers, carpenters, millwrights, boiler makers, iron workers, elevator constructors. So rather than trying to go out and figure out a meeting with 16 separate business managers in town, we have an organization. It's a national organization of building trades unions. And so each geographical area has a council like this, so that there's one avenue that a developer or client or potential employer can come in and discuss big projects where you're going to need access to all these distinct crafts. So it's just a simplification rather than trying to set 16 meetings with individual managers.
So the question I had, and then we'll go to you, Mr. Croft. The question I had for the administration is, I don't know if this came about because of, or it just happened to be happening simultaneously to things like the TED project and the renovation at the, the Easy Park project. But let's look at the TED project, for example. We talk about $3.5 million in municipal funds. There's an argument to be made that that kind of project doesn't have municipal funds exactly. It's using private developer funds. How does this ordinance apply to those kind of projects where you have private developer funds and the municipality is helping in some other way, like contributing land or providing tax abatement or whatever we're doing?
This is it's explicitly limited just to construction projects.
Okay.
So land swaps, tax abatements are not included by definition.
So it wouldn't, the TED, for example, the Tudor-Elmore development, is the interpretation that even though we're building an HSS building there, it would not apply in that case?
And I don't know all the ramifications of that, Ted, but in general, we aim to simplify that. This first step out is simply construction cost, construction projects.
Okay. Mr. Croft.
Yes, a similar line. So it doesn't cover ASD, right?
ASD, no.
And municipal entities as opposed to the municipality proper?
Municipal entities are part of the municipality, so anything that goes through Title VII, through the purchasing code, would be under this auspice. So, for instance, ACDA is not subject to Title VII. So it would not be.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, Mr. Weldon.
While we're on this page 4 with the different groups, it could be, from what it says, military veterans. I think in the AO it mentions people re-entering from jail. That's not listed here. Is that being taken out, or am I missing it?
Mr. Weddleton, I would assume it's an oversight. And again, most of the details of this would be in the actual work agreement, the master work
It's on there.
agreement.
It's not on their PowerPoint though. It was just it's not that Sorry, so that is in there. It just wasn't listed in the PowerPoint.
I think the intent is that it is included.
I think it's on page 4, number 5.
Correct.
In the AO.
Struggling with
Yes.
re-entry.
Okay. I was just, it wasn't in the PowerPoint, so I thought, this stuff still where she would be developed.
That's in there. Okay, thank you, Mr. Weddleton. So with that, we still have some time for audience participation. And Ms. LaFrance, if there's somebody else that you want to hear from, now would be the time to ask them to come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When Mr. Weddleton was asking his questions regarding apprenticeship and how it may be handled in the private sector, I know that there's someone from ADC here as well, and I just wanted to point that out.
Okay. Do they want to speak? Do you want them to speak?
Sure.
Okay. If you identify yourself for the record, please.
Sure. I am Greg Rhodes. I am a representative of ABC, Associated Builders and Contractors. I currently sit on the board for the organization. I'm also project manager for Samson Electric, who employs a great many people here in the community, apprentices and journeymen alike. I have a couple of handouts I'd like to present to the assembly here so that we can kind of set the record straight on some of the statistics versus, merit shop and union contractors. It's a little bit more catered towards state versus, the actual municipality of Anchorage, but I think they'll translate very well through, just kind of the statistics overall. Basically, the statistics on the front cover there, we are in the state 76% merit shop, little more than 23% union labor throughout the state. Just kind of throwing that out there as a vital piece to this puzzle. One of the things that I'd really like to kind of key on, and I will echo the sentiments of Rodney and Karen with the Trades Council. A vibrant and robust apprenticeship program is critical, 100% critical to our economy, our future, and the building construction and the construction of our great city. One of the things that I think is being misrepresented is that there's only one avenue. There are multiple avenues, and I'm not saying one is better or one is worse, but I'm saying that there are multiple avenues that are not being considered here. And basically, from my personal standpoint, I feel like it's flat out discrimination. I think that that's one of the things that we as a community are trying to avoid. We as a community want to be inclusive, and I just can't get over that one aspect of this ordinance. So what I will key in on is a statement that I picked up from the mayor himself. And it says, a welcoming and resilient Anchorage is a city that is inclusive, ready, and sustainable. This goes against every bit of that. I'll be perfectly honest. From my standpoint, this goes against every bit of that. And that is probably one of the biggest statements that I'll make right here. Again, I don't think it's good for the municipality. I don't think it's good for the city of Anchorage. The statistics are there. Not only is it going against and discriminating against the better part of the workforce, it's also, even if it was 1 or 2% that you're discriminating against, that's opportunity that's being missed, and that's opportunity that's being, looked over.
So I should be clear here. So this is not public testimony, right?
Okay.
We will have time for public testimony on the night of, and you'll have the opportunity to speak, and anyone else wants to speak. But the intent was to answer any questions Ms. LaFrance or Mr. Wellington had. If you don't have any further questions, then I'd like to have a little bit of time for audience participation before we roll to the special meeting.
Okay. This is an audience, though, right?
What's that?
This is audience.
Sure, but we want to allow a couple more people to speak probably.
I got 3 questions.
Okay.
What's
that?
I guess in your Samson Electric, what percent are apprentices generally in jobs that you would do?
We currently have well over 30 apprentices working for us. I would say it's probably a 25 to 28%. Roughly, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but yeah, we focus heavily on training our people.
Okay, and then if I could, the core thing, is it really anti-competitive? I mean, what we're hearing here is that you can bid, and if you have a crew you like on that project, you say, okay, go over to these trade union hiring halls, and we will request you, and you'll come back. So it's kind of a little speed bump, but it gets you in the game, and you bid on it, and you get your people back. So is that anti-competitive?
In a lot of ways, I feel it is. It is, in essence, creates a burden for us that creates more overhead. Our retirement accounts are separate. We have 401ks. They have a defined pension. There's a lot of, I would assume there's a lot of, overhead costs that would be burdened by the employer, prohibited.
So would the person have to pay into their retirement and also yours? I haven't thought about that.
I believe so.
Well, that'd be weird. Okay, suppose there's more of it.
Okay.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Vance. So this will have to be it because we are coming up against the time when we have to move into the special meeting.
What are the requirements for the apprenticeship program? How many hours?
It's very similar. We have an 8,000 hour requirement and 4 years of school work for our electrical apprentices and our plumbing apprentices. I believe the carpenters and the other trades are very similar.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. France. Thank you, sir. So that's going to be all our time today for this work session. We'll take a 5-minute break, can use the restroom, what have you, and then we're going to enter into our special meeting and quasi-judicial hearing. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.